Hi y'all, and welcome back to the garden. I wanted to show you all a few things that are blooming around the garden right now and show you some projects that I'm going to be doing this weekend. One of them is this lollipop crabapple that I showed you a couple videos ago, I think, that I got planted. It's blooming really nicely, so you can see what it's going to look like in future years. I like that the buds are kind of pink and then it comes out white. We have been having a lot of perennials push a ton of growth because it's been like 70 all week and the temperatures have not been incredibly low. I think the April garden is going to end up being more like the May garden was last year and in years prior. I've got some daffodils that are still blooming really lovely behind me. It was one of those points where I came out to the yard yesterday and I kind of got emotional because I was like, well, I did this. I spent all this time last year getting all of these bulbs planted, even though I really didn't want to, because it's not my favorite project and they look really great. So I'm glad I spent that time and invested in that. I am going to take you up front and show you why I don't plant tulips in the ground. I had someone comment on a video I posted on Instagram of all of these tulips in this bed here that are kind of going out of bloom. These are fresh right here because they just started blooming. They're a late blooming variety and all of these are going out. But she was asking whether I would be putting these in the ground, and my answer to that was no, because tulips just don't return well here. They don't return well in general. There are some varieties called Darwin that tend to return better, but they do fizzle out. And so here where I have heavy clay soil, a lot of people say just plant them and pull them up at the end of the season. You can't pull bulbs up in my soil. It's not fluffy enough. You just break the foliage off at the ground. And then in future years, it just continues to push foliage with no blooms, which looks really bad. So I'm going to take you up front and show you that right quick. And then you'll understand why I don't plant tulips in the ground. Now, I do have all of these daffodils that I will be pulling out of this bed because I had nowhere to put them in the fall. And I'm going to be putting them up front. And so I will probably try to do some of that this weekend. We do have some that have not bloomed yet, but we do have all these nice colors, and while they're still in bloom, I can arrange them where I want them. These are a little far behind and I'm not sure why. So this is a good indication of why I don't plant tulips anymore. I actually came through the other day and pulled them all, broke them all off at the ground because this is just foliage. This was a Darwin mix that I planted probably 4 years ago now, and all that comes up is foliage. I've had no blooms from these set for the past couple years, and I can't pull them up without actually having to dig them all up, so it's easier just to break them off at the ground in the spring, and so that's what I do here. Now this set, I am still getting a little bit of bloom from these Darwins, but you can see how small the tulips are. They're pretty much fizzled out, but the rest of these will not produce blooms. You can see it's just a little bit of foliage. So I'll actually probably come through here in the next week or so and break these off too. That way they don't gather any more energy and perpetuate this for years to come. I've been trying to break them off as much as I can. That'll give you a good understanding as to why I don't plant tulips in the landscape, because they're difficult to remove and they just produce foliage for years to come and take up space where I could put another bulb that will actually reliably rebloom for me, like daffodils. So it's kind of a trade-off here, but I don't have the soil conditions or fluffy enough soil conditions that I can put them in the landscape and feel good about it. But putting them in the raised garden bed last year, the discount tulips made me feel really good this spring when they all bloom. So I'll be doing that again this year, probably, if I can get my hands on some discount bulbs. Now, a priority this weekend is to show you how I cut back this bobo hydrangea hedge around my patio. So that'll be probably the next video that you see, because I definitely want to get that done. They're actually starting to push growth because it's been so warm. So I want to come back and shear that back quickly. But what I also want to get done, because it's just 3 weeks until my annuals arrive and I have my soil delivered then for my raised beds, I want to get this cleaned up. So I'm going to get the daffodils that I told you planted in the landscape up front. And then you can see here that we actually had some dahlia success over winter. I came through last weekend, I think it was, and uncovered, or sometime earlier this week, and uncovered these dahlias from the plastic. And we've got a lot of growth happening here. So you can see some of them clearly did not make it and they were mushy. You can see here's a tuber that I pulled up that was not growing, and the head here was actually mushy, but we do have some. So what I'm going to do here is put these into some plastic pots like those Prune Winter ones over there that I always keep on hand. and just set them to the side so I can get all of this soil out of here and this bed removed, that bed removed, and then put the final raised garden bed that I have right here. And I'll show you what all that looks like in the end. We have so many weeds because it's been such a warm winter and the mulch was just washed from the torrential downfalls of rain we had, that I've got to come through and do lots of weeding in the backyard. I've kind of focused on the front yard and trying to get as much done up there as possible, but some of the weeds are getting pretty big and I'm going to have to start focusing on them. I like to do my weed pulling after it has rained because the soil is moist and you can usually just pull it out by hand easier. And we've not had any substantial rain this week to actually moisten the soil. You could probably see in that image that I just showed you that the ground's actually cracking because it was so wet for so long, and then it's been dry and the ground's already cracking in April, which is not a good sign. But we have all sorts of little bees out pollinating all of these nice early blooming red buds here. So this is Lavender Twist. I really love this one. It'll get pretty bigger in future years, but I got it on discount a couple years ago at Lowe's at the end of the season. I think it was the end of 2021, and I planted it in this spot. And it's done really well. It took a little while to get going. Last year it didn't look so great, but this year it's doing much better. You know, I have like 4 red buds in my garden, all different sizes. Most of them stays pretty small, but my favorite of all of them is the Rising Sun red bud. I like it because the leaves start emerging when the buds actually bloom as well. So it has pink, and the Rising Sun emerges yellow, transitions to orange, and then transitions to green. And it has that on every leaf throughout the whole season, so it's always different colors, but particularly in the early spring and fall when it's putting on a lot of new growth. Summer it leans a little more green, but there's still some yellow and orange there. But right now it's this beautiful pink blooms tinged with yellow. Let me show you. I think I'm going to be doing a video on all the plants that I lost this year. I've been walking around the garden and I've noticed some. There's not any that are substantially large, and it's still a little early, so it's possible that they may come out. But I've already thrown one away, and that was the Tampa spruce. That spruce I had showed you before. It was up front around the big green spruce that I had. And it wasn't getting enough sun for years, and it was starting to fizzle out. So last year I moved it to the backyard. I think I actually moved it, it had to have been early spring last year, and I moved it back here to give it a second chance and kind of, you know, grow on some more, and it just did not do well. It didn't make it through the winter. It survived all spring and all summer and looked pretty good, but it just did not make it through the winter. So I'm not exactly sure why. But that one was not and has not been a strong variety in my garden. But there's been a couple other things I've noticed that have not started showing growth yet. Even some perennials, which have surprised me. So we'll give them a little longer, maybe next week or the week after I'll make that video, because I need to start coming through and pulling those things out and thinking of items to replace them if they did in fact not make it. If you're new here, I've always mentioned in this spot, because it's so close to this retention pond behind the home, that I have lots of issues with thistle in this area, and they are coming up everywhere. But I also planted all of these blueberry muffin ajuga back here to act as a ground cover to kind of suppress some of this issue in the future. And they're coming up nicely and blooming. So we have the nice purpley blue blooms there with this lamium in the front that's pink, the daffodils mixed in. So this is really pretty, but I need to come through and weed this area. This is probably the most prolific year I have had in the garden with weeds, and I'm not sure why. I know I didn't do a lot of mulching back here last year because my garden is, on screen it appears bigger than it is, but it's still a lot. A couple years ago, before I had even expanded it more, I had over 24 yards of mulch delivered that I had to put down, and that didn't even cover the whole garden. So I would probably say if I had to deliver mulch every year and mulched it fully every year, it would probably be close to 50 yards of mulch, which is insane. And so I'm not going to be doing that. At 50 might be an overstatement, but it's a lot of mulch. And so I try to invest in these ground covers the past couple years so I can deal with some of these weed issues proactively and not have to do mulching every year in some beds. Some beds I also will heavily mulch 1 year, and so I don't have to mulch it the next year, like the incredible hydrangea hedge bed. I didn't mulch that bed at all last year, and you can see by the end of the year in the spring there were a few weeds on it. It's also the north side of the house, so there's not a lot of sun. It's not going to be a prevalent issue with weeds there to begin with, but I just mulched it again the other day, and I used some bigger mulch, and so hopefully I can get by with 2 years of not planting anything there. It's also really helpful if you're not planting a bunch of stuff in the beds after you already have mulch in them and disturbing the soil. So I've been doing a lot of planting over the past couple years, so you know, like I'm just going to be bringing weed seeds to the top. There's going to be soil on top of the ground that's going to make contact with weed seeds and germinate those weed seeds. So this bed, particularly under the willow, despite how shady it is, it's always been a significant issue with weeds, and it's got to be. My only thought is it's because of the retention pond behind me that grows all of these weeds, and then they get cut down every now and then and blow into my yard and germinate, which has become an increasing nightmare. So I'm thankful, or hope, when these green giants grow up, it'll provide a little more of a buffer for those weed seeds, and they won't make it to the garden and germinate everywhere where I have a disaster to clean up. Let's take you around and show you a few of the other things that are blooming right now. My oak leaf hydrangeas are just now starting to push growth. They're not blooming, of course, so it'll be a little while until those bloom. But if you'll remember this blue shadow 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 that I picked up last year that I really loved and planted in this location, it's got its blooms on it now. They're just tiny, tiny little things. Actually, darling, this is the only 𝗟𝗟𝗲𝗲 that I have in my garden, and I wasn't expecting it to be blooming this early. I just came out earlier this week and it was putting on buds, and now it's bloomed out a little bit, and it'll be putting on its leaves here soon, which are a nice blue gray leaf, very powdery blue that looks really great in the garden. A lot of the earlier blooming daffodils are blooming out, so I need to come through and just snap off the bud or the flower of these daffodils, and also the hyacinths are also coming out of bloom. You can see all the weeds here. All of these weeds is not something I would have probably showed you in prior years. I think in 2021-22, my garden was much smaller in 2021, but I had a lot of people comment when I was showing them videos. They're like, where are all the weeds? And I'm like, well, I don't have a lot of weeds, and I hadn't, because I could keep on top of it a lot easier, and the garden was smaller. These are Pretty Coats Peach Geum. They're kind of small this year. These were planted from plugs last year, and so they didn't do a whole lot, but I love this bloom. So geums are a really great plant if you want something that blooms really early in your garden. I've kind of fell in love with them and had them everywhere. So this is the Pretty Coats Peach, which I mentioned. It's a variety by Terra Nova Nurseries, I believe. And I also have another one up here. I think it's called Totally Tangerine or something similar to that. I'll show you right quick. That's also blooming. These are the Totally Tangerine. They're a little further along because they've been in the ground a couple years already. So they're actually just started leafing out, but they're already blooming. So they'll get much bigger and almost touch here. You can see how small they are now and how tiny these leaves are. They'll look more like the heuchera-sized leaves by the time they're done. We also have a few blooms of the Back to the Fuchsia Salvia, which is looking smaller this year than usual. So I'm not sure why it's not bulked up anymore, but we've got the 𝗂𝗂𝗀𝗃 coming back that I planted from the plugs last year. So that was intentionally planted to cover up all of these daffodils when they finish blooming. I'm actually going to consider removing the fountain covers this weekend or next week and filling those up, because it looks like we're getting pretty good weather for the next little bit. These are some of my favorite daffodils. I planted them really heavily back here. They are they bloom like 3 to a stem, and it's really hard to find. I can't remember the variety for these, but in zone 6, a lot of the daffodil varieties that bloom multiple flowers per stem are not hardy here. They're hardy in zone 7, but that must have been a variety I found from color blends that I picked up, and seems to be hardy here. Does pretty well. And I'm really excited about all of that yellow. But the intention is after this daffodil foliage dies down, that this 𝗂𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗃 will take over and fill in this area and be really lovely and beautiful. We also have this cherry, which isn't blooming prolifically, and I wonder if the winter may have gotten some of its buds. I'm not sure. This is Zuzu Cherry by Proven Winners. It is a shrub cherry. tree, and last year it had a lot more blooms on it, but this thing was a tiny like 3 or 4 inch container in 2020 when I planted it, and you can see how big it's got already. It grew very significantly fast. You can see it's got a few more blooms up here, but I'm not sure why it's not putting on more blooms than usual. It is a little early, so it may have some, but it should be covered in cherry blooms. We're just not getting them this year, but it was a rough winter. This is something that's not blooming, but it's this gold cone juniper that I picked out last year. It's really tiny, gets like, I think 2 foot wide and 3 to 5 foot tall or something along those lines. But all of its new growth is yellow, and look how striking that is early in the spring with the beautiful blue and the yellow tips there. I had a viewer asking about the snow sickle hydrangea. And it is, of course, just leafing out now. There's not a whole lot to see because it's so early in the spring, but this is a variety that I got last year. It's a new hydrangea called snow sickle, and it has these really long 12 to 14 inch panicles that are double blooms, and makes it really beautiful. But it survived winter really nicely. All of the stems are leafing out beautifully, so no dead wood, which is really nice. No pruning on this one. Oak leaves do bloom on old wood, so don't do any pruning on your oak leaves unless you need to control the sizing. And if you're going to do that, do it immediately after it blooms so it can set buds for next year. So we'll see, despite how bad the winter is, if the buds survived well. But it's looking really good right now. The oak leaves are coming out really beautifully. And look at these nice velvety leaves here. This is another daffodil that I have that is a 3 bloom per stem. It's really darling that I filled this bed with. So it's kind of sporadic here for now because I just planted 1 or 2 bulbs. I think I only did 1, but they were nice sized bulbs. It'll thicken up as years progress though and look quite nice. The heuchera are coming up pretty good that I planted here last year. Some of them are tiny still, like this red one back here. Some of the varieties just are not quite as hardy, it seems like, as others, so I'm hoping this fills in nicely, but if it doesn't, I may have to supplement it with some additional varieties. So thank you guys for following along today. I'm still in that cleanup, assess, and fix mode, I guess, for the spring. So cleaning up all of the weeds, mulching, assessing what needs attention immediately and what can potentially wait a little bit, and fixing things that did not make it, and planning for what will make the replacement. So thank you guys for following along, and remember, in a world full of hate, be a light. Take care, everyone. Bye.